the moment my nephew tugged on my sleeve and whispered, "Aunt, we need to go now." I knew something was wrong, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I bent down and looked under the table at my own sister's wedding. My heart practically stopped in my chest, my hands went cold, and for a split second I genuinely wondered if I was about to ruin the most important day of her life. So I need you to tell me honestly, before you judge anything else I say, was I wrong for what I did next, or would you have done the same thing if you were in my place? I'm jumping straight into that moment because even now, months later, that image under the table is burned into my brain. The music was playing, people were laughing, glasses were clinking, and everything looked perfect on the surface. But underneath, literally underneath all that happiness, there was something so disturbing that it changed how I see my family forever. And yes, this all happened at my sister's wedding, the day that was supposed to be about love, new beginnings, and celebration. Instead, it turned into the day I realized how blind I had been for years. Let me take you back to the beginning so you understand how we even got here. My sister, whom I'll call Sarah, is 3 years older than me. Growing up, she was always the golden child. Straight A's, captain of her cheer team, everyone loved her. I was more quiet, more observant, the one who stayed in my room reading or listening to music. But despite our differences, we were close. Or at least, I thought we were. When she met her now husband, Mark, about 6 years ago, I was genuinely happy for her. He was charming, successful, and the kind of guy who knew exactly what to say to make a good impression. My parents adored him instantly. Friends praised him. Even I thought, wow, she really found a good one. Sarah had a son from a previous relationship, my nephew, Ethan. He was 6 years old when Mark entered their lives. Ethan's biological father wasn't really in the picture, so Mark stepping up as a father figure was a big deal. At first, it seemed like a fairy tale. Mark would take Ethan to soccer practice, help him with homework, buy him gifts. Everyone kept saying how lucky Ethan was to have such an amazing stepdad. But there were small things, tiny moments, that made me uneasy, and I hate myself for not trusting my gut sooner. Ethan has always been closer to me than to anyone else in the family. Maybe because I listened to him, really listened. When adults would brush him off, I'd kneel down and look him in the eye. Over the years, he started seeking me out more and more. At family gatherings, he'd sit next to me. If he was upset, he'd find me. I thought it was just because I was the cool aunt. Now I realize it was because he felt safe with me. About a year into Sarah and Mark's relationship, I noticed Ethan becoming quieter. He wasn't as energetic, didn't laugh as much. Once, during a family dinner, Mark snapped at him for spilling juice, his voice sharp and angry in a way that felt disproportionate. Ethan flinched. No one else seemed to notice. I did. Later, when I asked Ethan if he was okay, he forced a smile and said yes. I wanted to push, but I didn't. I told myself I was overthinking. As the years went by, those moments added up. Ethan would avoid being alone with Mark. If Mark entered a room, Ethan would tense up. Once, I found Ethan sitting on the stairs during a family party, tears silently rolling down his face. When I asked him what was wrong, he whispered, "I don't like it when he's mad." That was all he said. I brought it up gently to Sarah, framing it as concern, not accusation. She brushed it off immediately, saying Mark was just strict and that Ethan needed structure. "You don't see everything," she told me, defensively, and I backed down. Again. Fast forward to the wedding. Sarah and Mark decided to have a big, lavish ceremony, hundreds of guests, fancy venue, the works. Everyone was excited. I was asked to be a bridesmaid, and Ethan was supposed to be part of the wedding party too. In the weeks leading up to it, Ethan seemed more anxious than ever. He barely spoke during dress fittings. On the morning of the wedding, I found him sitting alone in a corner of the bridal suite, hugging his knees. I asked him if he was nervous. He looked up at me with those big eyes and said, "Auntie, do we have to stay the whole time?" My heart sank, but again, I told myself it was just wedding nerves. The ceremony itself went smoothly. Sarah looked beautiful. Mark looked proud. Everyone clapped and cried and took pictures. If you were just an outsider, you'd think it was perfect. The reception was held in this huge ballroom, decorated with white flowers and soft lights. There was music, dancing, speeches, laughter. I tried to relax and enjoy it, but I kept an eye on Ethan. During dinner, Ethan was seated at a kid's table not far from the main family table. Mark was sitting next to Sarah, beaming. I noticed Ethan wasn't eating. He kept glancing under the table, then at Mark, then back down again. At first, I thought maybe he dropped something, but his face looked scared. Like genuinely scared. Then it happened. He got up from his chair, walked over to me, grabbed my hand, and whispered those words that still echo in my head. "Aunt, we need to go now." His voice was shaking. I asked him what was wrong, trying to stay calm. He didn't answer. He just squeezed my hand tighter and looked toward the table where Sarah and Mark were sitting. I crouched down, pretending to pick something up, and that's when I looked under the table. What I saw made my stomach drop. Mark's hand was stretched out under the table, gripping Ethan's ankle hard enough that his knuckles were white, not playfully, not gently. It was possessive, controlling, and terrifying. Ethan's leg was stiff, like he was afraid to move. In that moment, everything clicked. All the signs, all the unease, all the things I had ignored. My first instinct was pure rage. My second was panic. My third was fear of what would happen if I caused a scene. This was my sister's wedding, hundreds of people, cameras everywhere, music playing, and under the table, a grown man was silently hurting a child who trusted him. I slowly stood up, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. Mark looked at me and smiled, completely unaware that I had just seen what he was doing. Or maybe he thought I wouldn't dare say anything. I leaned down toward Ethan and whispered, "It's okay. I've got you." I felt his whole body relax just a little. Now, here's where I want you to really pay attention. Because this is where everything started to change. And this is where people later told me I overreacted. I gently but firmly took Ethan by the hand and led him away from the table. Mark noticed immediately. He frowned and asked where we were going. I told him Ethan wasn't feeling well and needed some air. He started to stand up, but I gave him a look that must have surprised him because he sat back down. Outside the ballroom, Ethan burst into tears, full on sobbing. He clung to me and kept saying, "I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything wrong." I held him and tried to calm him down, but inside, my mind was racing. I wanted to march back in there and confront Mark in front of everyone. I wanted to grab my sister and shake her and make her see what was happening. But I also knew that once I crossed that line, there was no going back. I asked Ethan, very gently, how long this had been happening. He hesitated, then whispered, "A long time." I asked him what Mark did when he got mad. Ethan shook his head and said, "I'm not supposed to tell." That sentence alone told me everything I needed to know. I told Ethan we were going to stay together for the rest of the night, no matter what. I took him back inside, but I kept him with me, far from Mark. I could feel Mark's eyes on us. I could feel the tension building. Sarah noticed something was off and asked me what was going on. I told her Ethan wasn't feeling well. She looked annoyed, like I was causing unnecessary drama. As the night went on, Mark approached me more than once, asking to take Ethan back to his seat. Each time, I made an excuse. Bathroom break, need water. Too tired. I could see his jaw clench. He was losing control, and that scared me more than anything. And this is where I need to pause and be completely honest. I was terrified. Terrified of being wrong. Terrified of accusing someone of something so serious. Terrified of destroying my sister's happiness if I was mistaken. But I was more terrified of what would happen to Ethan if I did nothing. By the time the cake was cut, I knew I couldn't just let this go. I knew that once the wedding was over, once the celebration ended, Ethan would go home with them. Back to the same house. Back to the same situation. And I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I let that happen without doing something. So that was the situation I was in. Standing at my sister's wedding, holding my nephew's hand, knowing something was very wrong, and realizing that whatever choice I made next would change our family forever. Before I tell you what happened after that, I want you to really think about it. If you were me, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace, or would you have risked everything to protect a child? Because what I did next is something my family still argues about to this day, and the fallout was bigger than I ever imagined. After that moment, standing there with my nephew's small hand wrapped tightly around mine, I felt like time slowed down. The music was still playing inside, people were still laughing, and somewhere behind those walls my sister was probably smiling for photos, completely unaware that her entire life was about to fracture. I remember looking down at Ethan and realizing something very clear and very terrifying. He wasn't asking me to leave the wedding because he was bored or tired. He was asking because he was scared, and he trusted me more than anyone else in that room to protect him. I told him to stay right beside me no matter what. I didn't let go of his hand for the rest of the night. When Mark came over again, his smile tight and forced, asking why Ethan was clinging to me, I felt something in me snap. I looked him straight in the eye and said, calmly but firmly, "He's staying with me." There was a long pause where neither of us spoke. His eyes hardened for just a second, and then he laughed it off in front of everyone, saying I was spoiling the kid. But I knew, and I think he knew that I knew. Sarah pulled me aside shortly after. She was annoyed, embarrassed, and clearly stressed. She asked me why I was making things weird on her wedding day. I wanted to tell her everything right then. I wanted to scream it. But Ethan was right there, holding onto my dress, listening to every word. So I chose my words carefully. I told her Ethan was uncomfortable and needed space. She rolled her eyes and said I was projecting my own issues onto her family. That hurt more than I expected. This was my sister, the person I grew up with, and she couldn't see what was right in front of her. The rest of the reception felt endless. I barely ate. I barely spoke to anyone. My entire focus was on keeping Ethan away from Mark and figuring out what to do next. When the night finally started winding down and guests began leaving, panic set in. I knew Sarah and Mark were supposed to leave together, as husband and wife, and Ethan would go with them. The thought made me sick. I made a decision that night that changed everything. I told Sarah that Ethan was coming home with me to spend the night. I said he was overwhelmed and needed rest. She immediately said no. Mark stepped in and said Ethan belonged with his family. That word, belonged, made my skin crawl. Ethan started crying quietly, begging not to go. That was the first time Sarah really looked at him. Not just glanced, but really looked. And for a brief second, I saw doubt flicker across her face. Still, she hesitated. She looked at Mark. He nodded slightly, reassuring her. And that's when I knew I couldn't rely on her anymore. I told her I was taking Ethan whether she liked it or not. That caused a scene. People stared. Voices were raised. Sarah accused me of ruining her wedding. Mark told me I was overstepping. But I didn't care. I knelt down, hugged Ethan, and told him we were leaving. We left the venue together, my heart pounding the entire drive to my apartment. Ethan barely spoke, but he didn't stop holding my hand. Once we got inside, I made him some hot chocolate and wrapped him in a blanket. He finally relaxed enough to fall asleep on my couch. I sat there all night watching him breathe, replaying everything in my head, wondering how I had let it go on for so long. The next morning, I called my parents and told them everything. Not vaguely, not carefully. Everything. What I saw under the table. What Ethan told me, how scared he was. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. My mother cried. My father asked if I was sure. That question hurt, but I understood it. Accusations like that are heavy, life-altering. But I was sure. When Ethan woke up, I gently asked him if Mark ever hurt him. At first, he shook his head. Then he started crying and said he didn't want Mark to be mad. I told him he wasn't in trouble, that he was safe, and that none of this was his fault. Slowly, piece by piece, the truth came out. Mark would grab him when he was angry, squeeze his arm, his leg, whisper threats. Tell him not to tell anyone or his mom would be sad. It wasn't just that one night. It had been happening for years. I contacted Child Protective Services that same day. That was one of the hardest calls I've ever made. I knew once I did that, there was no going back. An investigation started almost immediately. Ethan stayed with me temporarily while everything was sorted out. Sarah was furious. She called me screaming, accusing me of lying, of poisoning her son against her husband, of destroying her marriage. Mark sent me messages that were calm on the surface, but dripping with menace underneath. I stopped responding. The investigation uncovered more than I ever expected. Teachers had noticed changes in Ethan's behavior. A neighbor had heard yelling. Suddenly, all the pieces fit together. Mark denied everything, of course. He played the victim, claimed I was obsessed, unstable, jealous of my sister's happiness. Some family members believed him. Others didn't. The family split down the middle, and I became the villain in many people's eyes. Sarah didn't speak to me for months. When she finally did, it wasn't to apologize. It was to ask me how I could do this to her. I told her the truth, again. I told her I loved her, but I would choose Ethan every single time. That conversation ended with her hanging up on me. Eventually, Mark was removed from the home during the investigation. Sarah was forced to confront the reality she had been avoiding. It took time, therapy, and a lot of pain, but she finally listened to Ethan without Mark in the room. I wasn't there when it happened, but she later told me that was the moment her world shattered. She filed for divorce not long after. The aftermath was messy. Court dates, therapy sessions, family gatherings that no longer happened, holidays spent apart. I lost relationships with people I thought would always be in my life. I was blamed, judged, whispered about. But Ethan started to change. He laughed again. He slept through the night. He stopped flinching when adults raised their voices. And every time I doubted myself, I looked at him and knew I had done the right thing. Now, years later, Sarah and I are slowly rebuilding our relationship. It's not what it used to be, and it never will be, but there's honesty now. She's apologized, not just once but many times. She carries guilt she'll probably live with forever. I don't rub it in. There's no point. What matters is that Ethan is safe. So when I think back to that moment at the wedding, when my nephew whispered, "Aunt, we need to go now," I realize that was the moment I stopped being just an aunt and became his protector. It cost me comfort, relationships, and peace. But I would do it all again without hesitation. Sometimes doing the right thing means becoming the bad guy in someone else's story. Sometimes it means ruining a wedding, breaking a family, and standing alone while people question your motives. But if liking this video means you believe protecting a child is more important than protecting appearances, then like this video. If you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe. And tell me in the comments, honestly, would you have done the same thing? I'll see you all in the next story.